The scorching sun hung mercilessly over Ouagadougou's sprawling market, casting long shadows between the stalls where vendors hawked everything from hand-woven textiles to dried fish. It was here, amid the cacophony of haggling voices and the persistent buzz of motorcycles, that the first whispers began to spread like wildfire through the dusty corridors of commerce. Amadou Sankara, a grain trader whose weathered hands had counted countless sacks of imported rice and wheat over 3 decades, paused mid-conversation with a customer when he heard the rumor. Military helicopters, flying low over the savannah, carrying not soldiers or weapons, but massive wooden crates secured with heavy chains. The rotors kicked up enormous clouds of red dust that could be seen from kilometers away, their thunderous noise drowning out the usual sounds of rural life. "They say the helicopters come at dawn," whispered Fatima, an elderly woman who sold millet flour from a worn plastic basin. "My cousin in Koudougou saw them with his own eyes. 3 of them, flying so low the children ran inside thinking it was war." At first, the market buzzed with speculation. Some believed it was another military exercise, part of President Ibrahim Traoré's ongoing efforts to secure the country's borders against jihadist incursions from neighboring Mali and Niger. Others theorized it might be a relief operation from one of the many international aid organizations that had set up camp in Burkina Faso following the latest drought warnings. But when the first farmers returned from their fields 3 days later, their faces bore expressions of complete bewilderment. They spoke of landscapes transformed overnight, of thousands upon thousands of seeds scattered across the earth like a blessing from the sky itself. Maize kernels glinting in the early morning light, wheat grains nestled in the cracks of drought-hardened. Soil, peanuts, and cassava seeds spread in seemingly random patterns across hectares of land that had known only dust and despair for months. Salif Ouedraogo, a subsistence farmer from the village of Zitenga, described the scene to anyone who would listen. "It was like walking through a dream. The ground was covered with more seeds than I've seen in my entire life. Not planted in rows like we do, but everywhere, scattered by the wind as if the ancestors themselves had opened their hands and let abundance fall from the heavens." The bizarre sight contradicted everything these farmers knew about agriculture. For generations, they had planted by hand, carefully placing each seed in precisely measured rows, conserving every kernel because seeds were precious and expensive. The idea of scattering tons of grain from the sky seemed not just wasteful, but almost sacrilegious. Yet there they were, thousands upon thousands of seeds of every variety imaginable, drought-resistant millet that could survive on minimal rainfall, hardy sorghum varieties that thrived in poor soil, robust maize hybrids, protein-rich cowpeas, and even cassava cuttings that had somehow survived the aerial drop. The sheer diversity was staggering, suggesting a level of planning and investment that went far beyond any typical agricultural intervention. In the capital, government officials maintained strict silence. Press inquiries were deflected with standard responses about ongoing agricultural development programs. But in the corridors of power, a select inner circle knew the truth. President Ibrahim Traoré had authorized what was perhaps the most ambitious and unconventional agricultural operation in modern African history. The operation had been months in the planning, conceived in the deepest secrecy within the walls of the presidential palace. Traoré had assembled a team of agricultural scientists, military logistics experts, and political strategists to design what he privately called Project Sky Seeds, a massive aerial seed deployment that would cover over 50,000 hectares of Guiu, Burkina Faso's most drought-affected regions. Dr. Aminata Kone, the country's leading agricultural scientist and one of the few women in Traoré's inner circle, had initially thought the president was joking when he first outlined the concept. "Sir, with respect, aerial seeding is used for forests and grasslands, not food crops," she had protested during an early planning meeting. "The survival rates would be terrible, and the cost would be astronomical." But Traoré had done his homework. He presented her with studies from Australia's massive aerial reforestation projects, data from Brazil's savanna rehabilitation programs, and detailed analyses of emergency food production strategies used in conflict zones. More importantly, he had identified a critical vulnerability in Burkina Faso's food security that conventional agriculture could not address quickly enough. "Doctor," he had said, leaning forward across the polished mahogany table in his private office, "we are 3 years into erratic rainfall patterns. Our traditional farming calendar has been destroyed. International grain prices are soaring, and our people are becoming more dependent on imports every month. If we wait for normal planting seasons and normal weather patterns, we will wait forever. Meanwhile, our children go hungry and our sovereignty erodes with every sack of foreign grain we must buy." The logic was undeniable, even if the method was radical. Burkina Faso, like much of the Sahel region, had become trapped in a vicious cycle. Climate change had made traditional rain-fed agriculture increasingly unreliable, forcing the country to import larger quantities of basic staples each year. This dependency not only drained foreign currency reserves, but also left the population vulnerable to global food price shocks and the political whims of exporting nations. Traoré's plan was to break this cycle through sheer audacity and scale. By deploying seeds across vast areas simultaneously, the operation would maximize the chances that some areas would receive adequate rainfall while creating a distributed network of food production that could not be easily disrupted by localized weather events. But the genius of the plan extended far beyond agriculture. Traoré understood that food sovereignty was ultimately about political sovereignty, and that any successful challenge to the existing order would face fierce resistance from those who profited from Africa's dependence. The complexity of Project Sky Seeds was staggering, requiring a level of coordination that would have challenged a major military operation. In a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, teams of agronomists worked around the clock to create seed mixtures tailored to specific microclimates across the country. Dr. Koné's laboratory had become the nerve center of the operation. Detailed soil samples from hundreds of locations were analyzed for pH levels, mineral content, and water retention capacity. Satellite weather data was cross-referenced with historical rainfall patterns to identify zones with the highest probability of receiving adequate moisture. Even wind patterns were mapped to predict seed dispersal after the drops. "We're not just throwing seeds into the wind and hoping for the best," Dr. Koné explained to her team of young researchers, many of whom had returned from European universities specifically to work on this project. "Every drop zone has been selected based on a complex algorithm that considers soil chemistry, topography, predicted rainfall, and even the migration patterns of birds that might eat the seeds before they can germinate." The seed selection process was equally sophisticated. Rather than relying solely on commercial varieties, the team had partnered with agricultural research institutions across West Africa to source indigenous crop varieties that had been cultivated in the region for centuries. These traditional varieties, often overlooked by commercial agriculture, possessed genetic traits that made them ideally suited to local conditions. From Senegal came a drought-resistant millet variety that could survive on less than 400 millimeters of annual rainfall. Ghana contributed a fast-growing cassava cultivar that could produce tubers within 6 months. Nigeria provided cowpea seeds that could fix nitrogen in the soil while producing protein-rich beans. Mali shared sorghum varieties that could withstand both drought and flooding. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of the seed strategy was the inclusion of what Dr. Koné called ecosystem builders. Plants specifically chosen not for their food value but for their ability to restore soil health and create favorable growing conditions for other crops. Deep-rooted shrubs would break up compacted soil and bring minerals to the surface. Nitrogen-fixing legumes would enrich the earth. Fast-growing grasses would prevent erosion and provide biomass for composting. The logistics were equally complex. Acquiring 100 tons of high-quality seed required negotiations with suppliers across multiple countries. often conducted through intermediaries to avoid arousing suspicion. Payment was made through a maze of transactions involving gold sales, barter agreements, and diplomatic channels to avoid triggering international monitoring systems that tracked large agricultural purchases. Colonel Isaka Uedraogo, Traoré's military logistics coordinator, had to solve the puzzle of transporting and storing such massive quantities of seed without detection. "We couldn't use commercial storage facilities because word would leak," he later recalled. "We couldn't use military warehouses because that would signal government involvement too early. So we created a network of private storage sites, each holding small quantities, scattered across the country like a jigsaw puzzle that only we could assemble. The helicopter operation itself required military precision. 6 Mi-17 transport helicopters were quietly diverted from routine patrol duties and modified with specialized dispensing equipment designed by engineers at the University of Ouagadougou. The dispensers had to distribute seeds evenly across large areas while accounting for wind speed, altitude, and forward velocity. Flight paths were planned to avoid populated areas and maintain the element of surprise. Pilots conducted practice runs using sand instead of seeds, perfecting their timing and coordination. Each helicopter crew was sworn to secrecy and told only that they were participating in a classified agricultural development project. Weather windows were critical. The operation had to be completed during the brief transition period between the dry season and the onset of the rainy season, a window that might last only 2 or 3 weeks. Miss it, and the seeds would either desiccate in the heat or be washed away by torrential rains. But Traoré was thinking beyond the immediate agricultural challenge. He understood that the seed drop would inevitably be seen as a political act, a declaration of independence from the global food system that had kept Africa in a position of chronic dependence. He was prepared for the backlash and had begun laying the groundwork for what he anticipated would be a prolonged conflict with international interests. Secret meetings were held with sympathetic leaders across West Africa. Chad's president expressed quiet support. Ghana's agricultural minister offered technical assistance. Even Senegal, traditionally aligned with French interests, signaled through back channels that it would not oppose the initiative if it proved successful. Traoré also reached out to agricultural research institutions in Asia and Latin America, regions that had successfully broken free from agricultural dependency through bold policy interventions. Brazil's experience with savanna transformation provided crucial technical guidance. India's Green Revolution offered lessons about scaling agricultural innovation rapidly. Most importantly, Traoré began building what he called political insurance, a network of international relationships that would make it difficult for hostile powers to isolate Burkina Faso if the operation succeeded. Trade agreements were quietly negotiated with Turkey, Egypt, and Malaysia. Cultural exchange programs were established with universities in China and India. Military cooperation agreements were explored with Russia and Iran. The goal was to create a situation where any attempt to punish Burkina Faso for its agricultural independence would risk damaging relationships with multiple global powers, making the cost of retaliation prohibitively high. At exactly 5:47 a.m. on a cloudless Tuesday morning in late April, the operation began. The first helicopter lifted off from a concealed military base outside Koudougou, its cargo hold filled with 16 tons of carefully sorted seeds. The pilot, Captain Burema Tapsoba, had flown combat missions against jihadist insurgents, but nothing had prepared him for the surreal experience of bombing the countryside with food. "It felt like we were planting hope from the sky," he would later tell his wife. "Every time we opened the cargo doors and watched those seeds cascade down like brown rain, I thought about my grandmother, who used to say that the earth remembers every kindness." The operation was choreographed with military precision. Each helicopter followed a predetermined flight path, dispensing specific seed varieties at designated coordinates. GPS systems ensured accurate placement, while ground teams with radio communications provided real-time weather updates and confirmed successful drops. In the dense forests of the southwest, quick germinating millet was scattered across clearings where wildlife could access it within weeks. Along the semi-arid belt near the Mali border, deep-rooted cassava and drought-resistant sorghum were deployed in patterns designed to create food corridors for both humans and migrating animals. In the Central Plains, maize hybrids and groundnuts were distributed across areas with the highest probability of receiving adequate rainfall. The psychological impact on the helicopter crews was profound. These were soldiers who had spent years fighting a defensive war against insurgents, watching their country slowly fracture under the pressure of violence and economic desperation. Now, they were participating in an operation that felt fundamentally creative rather than destructive. We had been dropping bombs and fighting enemies for so long that we had almost forgotten what it felt like to be builders, recalled Lieutenant Colonel Zongo, the operations flight commander. That morning, watching seeds fall like stars across the land, we remembered that we were not just defenders of Burkina Faso, but creators of its future. The operation was completed in 6 days, covering an area roughly the size of Belgium. 100 tons of seeds were distributed across 847 drop zones, each carefully selected for its ecological characteristics and strategic importance. The final helicopter landed just as the sun set on the 6th day, its cargo holds empty, its mission complete. But even as the last rotor blades fell silent, the real challenge was just beginning. Seeds scattered from the sky faced enormous odds against survival. Without irrigation, fertilization, or the careful tending that traditional farming provided, germination rates were expected to be low. Wildlife would consume many seeds before they could sprout. Others would fall on unsuitable soil or be damaged by the impact of the drop. Traoré had anticipated these challenges and built contingencies into the plan. The seed mixture included varieties with different germination timelines, ensuring that even if early rains failed, later moisture could still trigger growth. Decoy seeds, treated with bitter compounds that made them unpalatable to birds and rodents, were mixed in to protect the viable seeds during the vulnerable early period. Most importantly, the operation was designed to succeed even with high failure rates. If only 20% of the seeds germinated and reached maturity, the harvest would still be significant enough to impact food security and demonstrate the viability of the approach. If 50% succeeded, it would transform the country's agricultural landscape. If more than that survived, it would represent one of the most successful large-scale agricultural interventions in modern history. News of the seed drop did not remain secret for long. Within 72 hours, satellite imagery had captured the unusual activity, and intelligence networks across 3 continents were analyzing the implications. In the air-conditioned offices of international grain trading companies, executives gathered around conference tables to assess what they perceived as a direct threat to their African market share. Marcus Thornfield, CEO of Continental Grain Holdings, one of the world's largest agricultural commodity traders, convened an emergency board meeting at the company's London headquarters. The mahogany-paneled conference room overlooked the Thames, its walls lined with charts showing global grain flows and market projections. "Gentlemen," Thornfield began, his crisp British accent cutting through the tension, "what we're seeing in Burkina Faso is not just an agricultural experiment. It's a direct challenge to the market structures that have governed African food security for decades. If this succeeds, it won't stop at Burkina Faso's borders." The implications were clear to everyone in the room. Burkina Faso imported roughly 400,000 tons of grain annually, generating millions in profits for international traders. But more importantly, the country served as a distribution hub for much of the Sahel region. If Burkina Faso achieved food self-sufficiency, it could trigger a domino effect across West Africa, potentially eliminating markets worth billions of dollars. Sarah Chen, the company's chief political risk analyst, presented her assessment with characteristic bluntness. Traoré is not just trying to feed his people. He's attempting to break the cycle of dependency that has been the foundation of our African operations for 30 years. If he succeeds, every government from Senegal to Chad will want to replicate his model. The response was swift and multifaceted. Within a week, European agricultural lobby groups began circulating position papers questioning the environmental safety of large-scale aerial seeding. Academic researchers, some funded by industry grants, published op-eds warning about the risks of introducing non-native plant varieties into fragile ecosystems. French diplomatic channels, traditionally protective of Francophone Africa's agricultural markets, quietly conveyed concerns to African Union headquarters about the precedent being set by unilateral agricultural interventions. The message was subtle but clear. Such actions could destabilize regional food markets and threaten the carefully managed aid relationships that had maintained political stability. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Foreign Agricultural Service flagged the Burkina Faso operation as a potential threat to American grain exports to Africa, a market worth over $2 billion annually. Internal. Memos, later leaked to investigative journalists, revealed discussions about using development aid leverage to discourage other African governments from pursuing similar programs. The pressure campaign extended to international financial institutions. The World Bank, which had provided significant funding for Burkina Faso's agricultural development programs, quietly suggested that future loans might be conditional on adherence to international best practices in agricultural development, code. For maintaining reliance on established supply chains and technical assistance programs. But Traoré had anticipated this reaction and had been quietly building defensive alliances for months before the operation. In a series of discreet diplomatic meetings, he had secured commitments from several African governments to resist external pressure against agricultural innovation initiatives. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo had privately assured Traoré of support, recognizing that Ghana's own food security challenges could benefit from similar bold approaches. Nigeria's agricultural minister had expressed interest in technical cooperation, seeing potential applications for Nigeria's vast but underutilized agricultural lands. Most significantly, Traoré had secured the backing of Ethiopia's prime minister, Abiy Ahmed, whose own experience with agricultural transformation had made him sympathetic to unconventional approaches. Ethiopia's support was crucial because it provided a counter-narrative to claims that the seed drop was reckless or unprecedented. Every agricultural revolution in history has been dismissed as impossible until it succeeded, Ahmed had told Traoré during a private meeting in Addis Ababa. When Ethiopia began its soil restoration program, critics said we were wasting money on degraded land. Now we feed ourselves and export surplus. Your critics today will be asking for your technical assistance tomorrow. For 12 agonizing days after the seed drop, the skies remained cloudless. The scattered seeds lay exposed on the cracked earth, vulnerable to birds, wind, and the relentless heat that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. International media coverage was uniformly skeptical, with headlines like "Africa's Latest Folly" and "The 50 Million Gamble" dominating news cycles. French television stations, which reached much of Francophone West Africa, featured agricultural experts who dismissed the project as a publicity stunt that will yield nothing but disappointment. German agricultural scientists published papers questioning the ecological wisdom of introducing large quantities of potentially invasive plant species into fragile Sahelian ecosystems. Even within Burkina Faso, doubt began to creep in. Opposition. Politicians, who had been largely silent during the operation, began making public statements questioning the wisdom of the massive expenditure. Rochmark Christian Caboret, the former president who had been ousted by Traoré's military government, issued a statement from exile calling the seed drop a desperate gamble by a desperate leader. In the markets of Ouagadougou, grain prices began to rise as traders, anticipating the failure of the project, reduced their stocks in preparation for increased demand for imported food. Some farmers in the target areas, convinced that the scattered seeds were worthless, began collecting them to sell as chicken feed. Traoré felt the pressure but maintained his public composure. During his weekly radio address, he spoke calmly about the long-term vision behind the project. Agriculture is not just about this year's harvest. It is about building resilience for the next generation. We have planted not just seeds, but possibilities. Privately, however, even he was beginning to worry. Daily reports from meteorological stations showed no significant rainfall predicted for the next 2 weeks. If the seeds desiccated before germinating, the entire project would indeed become the expensive failure that critics predicted. It was Dr. Kone who provided the reassurance he needed. "Mr. President," she said during an emergency meeting on the 11th day, "the seed varieties we selected were specifically chosen for their ability to remain viable in dry conditions. Some can survive up to 30 days without water. Others will germinate with just minimal moisture. We still have time." Her confidence was based on extensive research into drought-resistant varieties developed by agricultural institutions across Africa. The Sudanese Agricultural Research Corporation had provided millet seeds that could survive extended dry periods by entering a state of dormancy until conditions improved. Ethiopian highland varieties could germinate with moisture levels that would kill conventional crops. Most importantly, the team had included traditional varieties that had been cultivated in the region for centuries, seeds that had evolved alongside the unpredictable Sahelian climate and possessed genetic adaptations that modern commercial varieties lacked. On the 13th day, salvation arrived in the form of a weather pattern that meteorologists called an anomalous moisture intrusion, a band of humid air from the Atlantic that had somehow penetrated deep into the Sahel region. Dark clouds began forming on the western horizon just after noon, their towering cumulus heads promising the first substantial rainfall in over 3 months. The storm struck at sunset, beginning with heavy drops that pattered against the dust like nature's own percussion. Within an hour, the isolated drops had become a steady downpour that continued through the night. By morning, the parched earth was dark with moisture, and shallow pools of water reflected the early sunlight across the landscape. But the real miracle began 3 days later. Across hundreds of square kilometers, the first green shoots began pushing through the earth. They appeared tentatively at first, tiny blades of grass, minuscule leaves, thread-like stems barely visible against the dark soil. But within a week, the scattered patches of green had become visible from the air, creating a patchwork pattern across the savanna that looked like nature's own abstract art. Amadou Sankara, the grain trader who had first heard whispers of the operation in Ouagadougou's market, was among the first to witness the transformation. Driving to visit relatives in the village of Manga, he stopped his motorcycle in amazement when he crested a hill and saw the valley below carpeted with young plants. It was like watching the earth come alive, he later told anyone who would listen. Where there had been nothing but dust and stones, now there were millions of green shoots reaching toward the sky. I had never seen anything like it in my 53 years. The scientific data was even more remarkable. Dr. Kone's field teams, conducting germination surveys across the drop zones, recorded success rates that exceeded their most optimistic projections. In areas that received adequate rainfall, germination rates approached 70% for some varieties. Extraordinary for any aerial seeding operation, let alone one conducted under such challenging conditions. The quick germinating millet, designed to provide immediate forage for wildlife, was sprouting in dense clusters that already showed signs of attracting grazing animals. Herds of antelope, which had migrated south in search of food, were beginning to return to areas where vegetation was emerging. Even more significantly, Livestock owned by pastoralist communities was being moved to take advantage of the new forage, reducing pressure on traditional grazing areas that had been devastated by overuse during the drought. The success of the germination phase triggered what Traoré's intelligence services would later classify as a coordinated international response designed to prevent the operation from reaching full maturity. The response was sophisticated, multi-layered, and involved actors ranging from multinational corporations to foreign intelligence services. Pierre Dubois, a former French colonial administrator who now worked as a consultant for European agricultural interests in Africa, arrived in Ouagadougou ostensibly as an observer for the European Commission's Humanitarian Affairs Office. His real mission was to assess the potential impact of successful large-scale agricultural independence in West Africa and to identify pressure points that could be exploited to contain the threat. Dubois' preliminary report, obtained months later by investigative journalists, was brutally frank about the stakes involved. If the Burkina Faso experiment succeeds, it will fundamentally alter the political economy of the Sahel region. Countries that have been dependent on European agricultural exports for basic food security will begin pursuing indigenous alternatives. This threatens not only our commercial interests, but our strategic influence throughout Francophone Africa. The report recommended a three-pronged strategy: economic pressure through trade restrictions and aid conditionality, political pressure through diplomatic channels and international organizations, and, if necessary, support for internal opposition to destabilize the Traoré government. The economic pressure began almost immediately. European Union agricultural inspectors suddenly discovered compliance issues with Burkina Faso's traditional exports of cotton and sesame seeds, creating bureaucratic delays that cost the country millions in lost revenue. Development loans from French and German banks, previously approved for infrastructure projects, were quietly frozen pending governance reviews. The World Food Program, citing concerns about uncoordinated agricultural interventions, reduced its planned food aid deliveries to Burkina Faso by 40%, creating artificial scarcity in urban areas where people still depended on subsidized grain. The reduction was presented as a budget constraint, but internal documents later revealed it was a deliberate attempt to create social pressure against the government. More insidiously, foreign-funded NGOs began distributing reports questioning the environmental impact of the seed drop. Glossy publications warned about soil degradation, genetic contamination of traditional crops, and disruption of wildlife migration patterns. The reports were carefully crafted to appeal to international environmental groups while avoiding specific claims that could be easily disproven. The political pressure was equally intense. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, European diplomatic missions worked behind the scenes to build opposition to what they termed unilateral agricultural interventions. They argued that such actions violated the spirit of international cooperation and could destabilize regional food markets. French President Emmanuel Macron, during a state visit to neighboring Senegal, made pointed comments about the importance of responsible agricultural development and the risks of experimentation that could threaten food security rather than enhance it. Though he never mentioned Burkina Faso by name, the target of his remarks was unmistakable. The pressure was not limited to official channels. Private security firms with ties to European intelligence services began recruiting local agents to monitor and report on the progress of the ceded areas. These operatives, posing as agricultural researchers, humanitarian workers, or journalists, fanned out across rural Burkina Faso to gather intelligence on germination rates, farmer reactions, and potential vulnerabilities in the project. But Traoré had his own intelligence network, and reports of foreign surveillance operations only strengthened his resolve. "Let them watch," he told his security chief during a late-night briefing. "When they see our success, they will realize that the age of African dependence is ending." The president's confidence was not misplaced. By the end of the first month, Satellite imagery confirmed what ground teams were reporting. The scattered seeds were not only surviving, but thriving in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The sabotage began subtly, almost invisibly at first. In the eastern province of Gourma, farmers reported that birds seemed unusually aggressive in consuming seeds, stripping areas clean with systematic thoroughness that suggested coordination rather than natural feeding behavior. Investigation revealed that the birds were being attracted by pheromone dispensers secretly placed around key seeded areas by operatives working for foreign agricultural interests. The discovery of the pheromone devices marked the beginning of what Traoré's security services classified as active sabotage operations. Colonel Musa Issoufou, the president's intelligence chief, had cut his teeth fighting terrorism in the Sahel region, but the enemy he now faced was more elusive and potentially more dangerous than any jihadist group. Terrorists want to destroy, he explained to his team during a briefing at military headquarters. But these enemies want to control. They don't want to blow up our crops. They want to ensure our crops fail, so we remain dependent on their grain. It's a more sophisticated form of warfare. The scope of the sabotage became clear when a routine inspection of a seed storage depot in the town of Dédougou uncovered evidence of contamination. Chemical analysis revealed that someone had introduced a fungal agent into stored seed supplies intended for a second phase of aerial deployment. The fungus would not kill the seeds immediately, but would prevent them from germinating, ensuring failure while leaving no obvious traces of tampering. The investigation, led by military police working with agricultural scientists, traced the contamination to a batch of organic soil treatment that had been donated by a European agricultural foundation and applied to the storage facility by well-meaning local workers who had no idea they were sabotaging their own country's food security. More attacks followed in rapid succession. In the central province of Kadiogo, irrigation channels feeding into seeded areas were found to contain industrial chemicals that would poison any plants attempting to use the water. In the north, diesel fuel was discovered mixed into rain barrels that local communities had placed to collect water for watering vulnerable seedlings. The pattern was clear. The sabotage was being conducted by a sophisticated network with access to technical expertise and specialized equipment. The attacks were designed to look like accidents or natural failures while systematically undermining the conditions necessary for the seeds to survive and thrive. Traoré's response was swift and decisive. He authorized Operation Clean Sweep, a coordinated security effort to identify and neutralize foreign operatives working within Burkina Faso's borders. The operation was conducted with surgical precision, targeting individuals who had entered the country on humanitarian or research visas, but whose activities did not match their stated purposes. Within 2 weeks, 14 foreign nationals were quietly detained and expelled from the country. Their confiscated equipment included sophisticated surveillance devices, encrypted communication systems, and in one case, laboratory-grade chemicals that had no legitimate civilian use. Documentation found in their possession revealed connections to private security firms, agricultural lobbying groups, and intelligence services from multiple countries. The expulsions sent a clear message to international observers. Burkina Faso would not tolerate interference in its agricultural independence project. But they also escalated the conflict to a new level. If foreign interests were willing to engage in sabotage to prevent the success of the seed drop, they would likely consider even more extreme measures as the harvest approached. Dr. Kone, working with her expanded research team, began implementing countermeasures to protect the growing crops. Traditional knowledge from elderly farmers was combined with modern agricultural science to develop natural pest control methods using local plants and minerals. Community watch groups were organized to monitor seeded areas and report suspicious activities. Most importantly, the project began to evolve from a top-down government initiative into a grassroots movement. Farmers who had initially been skeptical of the scattered seeds were now actively protecting and nurturing them. Children, walking to school, would divert their paths to check on seedling clusters. Herders would position their livestock to provide natural fertilization for growing plants. The transformation was psychological as much as agricultural. For the first time in years, rural communities felt like they were participating in something larger than mere survival. They were creating abundance where there had been scarcity, proving that African solutions could address African problems. By the end of the second month, the transformation was undeniable. What had begun as scattered seeds on barren earth had evolved into a complex agricultural ecosystem that was reshaping the landscape of rural Burkina Faso. Satellite imagery showed vast swaths of green where international experts had predicted only failure. The success was not uniform. Drought conditions in the far north had limited germination to less than 30% in some areas, but across the majority of the drop zones, the results exceeded all projections. In optimal conditions, germination rates approached 85%, creating dense stands of food crops where none had existed before. Dr. Kone's field teams documented the emergence of what they termed synergistic cropping systems, areas where different plant varieties had naturally organized themselves into mutually beneficial relationships. Nitrogen-fixing legumes were enriching soil for neighboring cereals. Deep-rooted cassava was bringing nutrients to the surface for shallow-rooted crops. Fast-growing millet was providing shade and wind protection for more delicate plants. The ecological benefits extended far beyond food production. Areas that had been devoid of wildlife were attracting birds, small mammals, and insects that contributed to pollination and natural pest control. Soil erosion, a chronic problem throughout. The Sahel region was being dramatically reduced by the extensive root systems of the new vegetation. Modibo Keita, a hydrologist working with the National Water Authority, documented how the increased vegetation was affecting local water cycles. The plants are transpiring moisture into the atmosphere, creating microclimates that encourage further rainfall. We're seeing increased humidity and temperature moderation in areas that were previously barren. It's like the land is healing itself. The agricultural success was generating political momentum that extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Mali, President Assimi Goïta announced that his government was studying the feasibility of similar aerial seeding programs for areas affected by desertification. Chad's agricultural minister visited Ouagadougou for technical briefings and returned home with sample seeds and growing protocols. Most significantly, the African Union's Agricultural Council voted to establish a working group on innovative food security initiatives, with Burkina Faso designated as the lead country. The resolution was a political victory for Traoré, legitimizing his approach within continental institutions and making it harder for external powers to isolate his government. But the very success of the project was escalating the stakes. Intelligence reports indicated that foreign interests were moving beyond economic pressure and sabotage toward more direct forms of intervention. Communications intercepts suggested that regime change scenarios were being actively discussed in European capitals and corporate boardrooms. The threat was not theoretical. In neighboring Niger, a military coup had recently overthrown a democratically elected government, with subsequent investigations revealing significant foreign support for the insurgents. Similar destabilization efforts had succeeded in Mali and Guinea, always following a predictable pattern: economic pressure, political isolation, support for internal opposition, and finally, direct intervention disguised as humanitarian concern. Traoré understood that his window of opportunity was narrowing. He needed to consolidate the agricultural gains quickly while building sufficient political support to deter foreign intervention. The solution was to accelerate the timeline and expand the scope of the project beyond what anyone had anticipated. A move that shocked both allies and enemies. Traoré announced the formation of the West African Food Sovereignty Alliance, a regional bloc committed to achieving collective agricultural independence within 5 years. The announcement was made during a surprise summit in Ouagadougou, attended by agricultural ministers from 7 countries and broadcast live across Africa. For too long we have accepted that a continent capable of feeding the world must instead beg for bread, Traoré declared, standing before a backdrop of images showing the green fields emerging from the seed drop. Today we commit to writing a different story, one where African soil feeds African people, where African innovation solves African challenges, and where our children inherit abundance rather than dependency. The alliance represented a fundamental shift in the geopolitics of African agriculture. Member countries committed to purchasing at least 60% of their grain imports from fellow African producers, sharing agricultural technology and expertise, and coordinating resistance to external pressure designed to maintain food dependency. Ghana's Minister of Food and Agriculture, Dr. Owusu Afriyie-Akoto, announced that his country would immediately begin implementing modified versions of Burkina Faso's aerial seeding program, adapted for Ghana's forest and coastal environments. We have seen proof that African solutions can achieve what decades of foreign aid have failed to accomplish, he declared. Niger's representative, despite his country's recent political turmoil, committed to sharing desert reclamation technologies developed for the Sahara's edge. Chad offered access to its advanced meteorological systems for coordinating planting across climatic zones. Mali contributed seeds from ancient varieties that had sustained empires along the Niger River for centuries. The announcement sent shockwaves through international agricultural markets. Commodity prices for corn, wheat, and rice, the staples, that West Africa imported in massive quantities, fluctuated wildly as traders struggled to assess the potential impact on their African operations. If the alliance succeeded, it could eliminate African import markets worth over $15 billion annually. European diplomatic responses were swift and sharp. The French Foreign Ministry issued a statement expressing deep concern about uncoordinated agricultural policies that could destabilize regional food security. The European Commission announced a review of development aid programs to ensure they aligned with internationally recognized agricultural best practices. But Traoré had anticipated this reaction and was already implementing what he privately called strategic diversification. Trade missions were dispatched to Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East to establish alternative partnerships that would reduce dependence on European markets and suppliers. A delegation to Vietnam secured technical cooperation agreements for rice cultivation in Burkina Faso's river valleys. Discussions with Brazil's agricultural research institutes opened possibilities for adapting tropical farming techniques to Sahelian conditions. Most significantly, preliminary agreements were reached with China for technology transfer programs that would help African countries develop their own agricultural equipment manufacturing capabilities. The alliance was not just about agriculture, it was about creating a new model of South-South cooperation that bypassed traditional North-South dependency relationships. Member countries would share not only crops and technology, but also financial systems, trade mechanisms, and political support for each other's sovereignty initiatives. As the growing season progressed into its critical phase, the intensity of foreign interference escalated to levels that bordered on economic warfare. The attacks were sophisticated, coordinated, and designed to create maximum disruption while maintaining plausible deniability. In early August, Burkina Faso's main internet infrastructure suffered a series of cyber attacks that crippled communication between agricultural monitoring stations and the Central Coordination Office. The attacks were traced to servers in multiple countries, making attribution difficult, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Simultaneously, Burkina Faso's banking system experienced unusual fluctuations that made it difficult for the government to process payments to farmers and agricultural workers. International currency transfers were mysteriously delayed, and several foreign banks suddenly discovered compliance issues that froze accounts containing funds designated for the harvest operation. Dr. Kone's research team faced their own challenges when sophisticated computer viruses corrupted months of agricultural data, forcing them to recreate crop monitoring systems from backup paper records. The viruses were designed to target specific agricultural databases while leaving other systems untouched, a level of precision that suggested involvement by state-level cyber warfare capabilities. But the most serious threat came through human channels. Colonel Isufu's counterintelligence network began detecting the presence of highly trained operatives whose profiles matched those of mercenaries involved in recent destabilization operations across Africa. These were not the amateur saboteurs who had been conducting earlier attacks, but professional soldiers with experience in regime change operations. Intercepted communications revealed discussions about targeting key infrastructure during harvest season. Not just agricultural facilities, but power grids, water treatment plants, and transportation networks that would be essential for processing and distributing the crop. The goal was not merely to destroy the harvest, but to create sufficient chaos to justify international intervention on humanitarian grounds. Traoré's response was to accelerate the harvest timeline and decentralize the entire operation, rather than waiting for optimal maturity. Crops that had reached minimal viability were harvested immediately and stored in hundreds of small facilities scattered across the country. Mobile processing units, essentially trucks equipped with grain cleaning and packaging equipment, were deployed to prevent the need for centralized processing that could be easily targeted. The strategy worked because it aligned with traditional African agricultural practices that emphasized resilience over efficiency. Rather than creating vulnerable choke points, the distributed system made it impossible for saboteurs to inflict crippling damage with limited attacks. Village-level storage cooperatives, organized along traditional clan and ethnic lines, took responsibility for protecting and managing local portions of the harvest. This created thousands of small stakeholders with personal interests in the project's success, making it politically impossible for any internal opposition to dismiss the initiative as a government vanity project. Meanwhile, Traoré was preparing for what he anticipated would be the final phase of the conflict, a direct challenge to his government's legitimacy. Intelligence reports suggested that foreign interests were preparing to support a military coup or popular uprising designed to remove him from power before the harvest could be completed and distributed. His preparation was methodical and comprehensive. Loyal military units were repositioned to protect key installations while maintaining the appearance of routine operations. Trusted civilian administrators were moved into critical positions throughout the government. Most importantly, secure communication systems were established with allied governments to ensure that any coup attempt would face immediate regional opposition. The attack came at 2:17 a.m. on a moonless Thursday night in late August, just 2 weeks before the main harvest was scheduled to begin. But it was not the military coup that Traoré's intelligence services had anticipated. Instead, it was something far more insidious and potentially more devastating, a coordinated attempt to poison the irrigation systems that fed the largest concentrations of maturing crops. The operation was discovered almost by accident when a night security guard at the Bagre irrigation facility noticed unusual activity near the main pumping station. 3 men in dark clothing were working with sophisticated equipment near the water intake, their actions illuminated briefly by a flashlight beam that revealed chemical containers and precision measuring devices. The guard, a former soldier named Dramane Sawadago, did not immediately raise an alarm. Instead, he observed from concealment while using his mobile phone to photograph the intruders and their equipment. His patience was rewarded when he captured images of equipment bearing Russian Cyrillic markings and chemical containers labeled in French, evidence that would later prove crucial in tracing the operation to its sources. When security forces arrived, they found a scene that chilled even hardened military veterans. The intruders had introduced a cocktail of industrial chemicals into the water system, compounds that would not immediately kill crops but would gradually poison them over several weeks, creating the appearance of natural disease while actually rendering the harvest toxic to humans and animals. Chemical analysis revealed the sophistication of the attack. The poisons were designed to accumulate in grain kernels and tubers, making them dangerous for consumption while leaving the plants themselves appearing healthy until the very end of the growing cycle. If successful, the operation would have made the entire harvest worthless, while creating a public health crisis that could be blamed on Traoré's reckless agricultural experimentation. But the saboteurs had underestimated both the resilience of the water system and the preparedness of the security forces. The irrigation network had been equipped with multiple filtration and testing stations precisely to defend against such attacks. The contaminated water was detected and isolated before it could reach the majority of the crops. Still, the message was unmistakable. Foreign interests were prepared to risk mass poisoning to prevent the success of Burkina Faso's agricultural independence project. The discovery of the plot sent shockwaves through the government and triggered the most intensive security operation in the country's recent history. Operation Iron Shield was implemented within hours. Military units surrounded all major agricultural installations. Water sources were tested hourly for contamination. Roads leading to crop zones were monitored by checkpoints equipped with chemical detection equipment. The country had effectively declared martial law over its agricultural sector. The international response to these security measures was predictably critical. Human rights organizations, many funded by the same corporate foundations that had economic interests in maintaining African food dependency, issued statements condemning the militarization of agriculture and calling for international monitoring of the situation. But Traoré had learned to read between the lines of such statements. When they call for international monitoring, they mean international control, he told his cabinet during an emergency meeting. They want observers who will find problems where none exist and create crises that justify intervention. The president's suspicions were confirmed when intelligence intercepts revealed that several of the human rights organizations calling for access to Burkina Faso's agricultural areas were receiving funding from the same corporate networks that had been conducting sabotage operations. The calls for transparency were actually reconnaissance missions designed to identify vulnerabilities for future attacks. As September arrived and the crops approached full maturity, the final battle for Burkina Faso's agricultural future began in earnest. The green fields that had emerged from the scattered seeds now represented more than food security. They had become symbols of African capability and self-determination that threatened the fundamental assumptions of global agricultural trade. Intelligence reports painted a picture of a coordinated international effort to prevent the harvest from reaching completion. The operation involved multiple actors working through supposedly independent channels, but with clearly coordinated timing and objectives. European grain companies began flooding West African markets with subsidized food, selling basic staples at prices below production costs to undermine the economic value of domestic production. The strategy was designed to create a situation where Burkina Faso's harvest, even if successful, would generate minimal revenue because international competitors were willing to accept losses to maintain market control. Simultaneously, international development agencies launched a public relations campaign highlighting the risks of large-scale agricultural experimentation. Reports were circulated claiming that Burkina Faso's aerial seeding had disrupted wildlife migration patterns, contaminated soil with foreign plant species, and created ecological imbalances that could take decades to correct. The most serious threat, however, came through diplomatic channels. At the United Nations, a coalition of European countries, supported by agricultural lobby groups, introduced a resolution calling for international oversight of unregulated agricultural interventions in fragile ecosystems. The resolution was carefully worded to avoid mentioning Burkina Faso directly while making it clear that the country was the target. If passed, the resolution would provide legal justification for international intervention in Burkina Faso's agricultural affairs. UN agricultural inspectors could be deployed to monitor the harvest, potentially creating opportunities for further sabotage while providing cover for intelligence-gathering operations. Traoré's diplomatic counteroffensive was masterful in its scope and timing. Working through the African Union, his government introduced a competing resolution celebrating indigenous agricultural innovation and calling for support for African-led food security initiatives. The resolution garnered immediate support from countries that had their own experiences with external interference in agricultural affairs. Ethiopia's Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, spoke passionately in support of Burkina Faso's initiative. When Africa innovates, the world calls it experimentation. When the West innovates, they call it progress. We reject this double standard and celebrate our brother nations' courage in pursuing food sovereignty. The debate became a proxy war over Africa's right to determine its own agricultural policies. Countries with histories of successful agricultural transformation, including Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Ghana, lined up behind Burkina Faso. Traditional. Partners of Western agricultural interests found themselves increasingly isolated as public opinion across Africa rallied behind the symbolism of homegrown solutions to homegrown problems. But while diplomats debated in air-conditioned conference rooms, the real battle was being fought in the fields and storage facilities of rural Burkina Faso. Colonel Issoufou's intelligence network had identified plans for a coordinated attack on harvest infrastructure that would make previous sabotage attempts look like minor annoyances. The plan, according to intercepted communications, involved simultaneous strikes on grain storage facilities, transportation networks, and processing equipment during the peak harvest period. The attacks would be conducted by highly trained operatives using sophisticated explosives and incendiary devices designed to create maximum damage while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties that could generate international sympathy for Burkina Faso. Most alarmingly, the intelligence suggested that some of the operatives had been provided with chemical weapons that could contaminate stored grain without leaving obvious traces of tampering. The weapons were reportedly supplied by a European defense contractor with a history of providing specialized equipment for regime change operations. Faced with the imminent threat of a coordinated attack on the harvest infrastructure, Traoré made a decision that would define his presidency and fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict. Rather than relying solely on military protection, he would mobilize the entire population of rural Burkina Faso to defend their shared agricultural future. The mobilization began with a series of community meetings in villages throughout the crop zones. Traoré himself appeared at many of these gatherings, arriving without fanfare in simple vehicles and speaking directly to farmers, herders, and their families about the threats facing their newly abundant fields. "This harvest belongs to you," he told a gathering of over 500 people in the village of Sapui, his voice carrying across the crowd without amplification. "It grew from seeds scattered by our plains, watered by our rains, and tended by your hands. No foreign power has the right to destroy what you have created." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, thousands of rural families had organized themselves into harvest protection committees, creating a human shield around the agricultural zones that would make large-scale sabotage operations impossible without massive civilian casualties that even the most cynical foreign interests would hesitate to cause. The protection network was organized along traditional lines that reflected the deep social structures of rural Burkina Faso. Village elders coordinated with youth groups to establish patrol schedules. Women's cooperatives took responsibility for monitoring storage sites during daylight hours. Hunter associations, with their intimate knowledge of the terrain and movement patterns, provided intelligence about unusual activities in remote areas. But The civilian mobilization was more than just a security measure. It was a political transformation that fundamentally altered the dynamics of the conflict. What had begun as a government agricultural project had evolved into a popular movement for economic self-determination that transcended ethnic, religious, and political divisions. Aminata Ouedraogo, a women's cooperative leader from the village of Kambasiri, captured the transformation in her address to a regional gathering. Before the sky seeds, we were always waiting for rain, waiting for aid, waiting for permission from others to feed our children. Now we are creating, we are protecting, we are deciding our own future. The psychological impact rippled far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Videos of families camping in their fields to guard growing crops spread across African social media, inspiring similar movements in countries facing their own food security challenges. In Niger, communities began organizing to protect their traditional seed banks from foreign interference. In Mali, farmers' associations started demanding greater control over agricultural aid programs. The civilian mobilization also created unexpected diplomatic opportunities. International media, initially skeptical of the seed drop project, found themselves documenting a story of popular empowerment that was difficult to criticize without appearing to oppose African self-determination. Images of children playing among maize stalks their parents were protecting became powerful symbols that complicated efforts to portray the project as government overreach. Religious leaders across multiple faiths began incorporating the agricultural project into their teachings, framing it as an example of human stewardship over creation. Islamic clerics spoke of the moral obligation to feed the hungry through one's own labor. Christian pastors referenced biblical passages about sowing and reaping. Traditional religious practitioners saw the project as a restoration of the spiritual relationship between people and land. The enemies of Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution made their final move during the third week of September, just as the main harvest was beginning in earnest. But rather than the coordinated military-style assault that intelligence services had anticipated, the attack came through economic channels designed to make the harvest worthless, even if it could not be physically destroyed. The operation was sophisticated and multi-layered, involving coordination between international grain trading companies, financial institutions, and government agencies across multiple continents. The goal was to create a situation where Burkina Faso's agricultural success would become an economic disaster that would discredit the entire approach to food sovereignty. Phase 1 involved flooding regional markets with subsidized grain at prices far below the cost of production. European and American agricultural exporters, supported by government subsidies disguised as humanitarian aid, began selling wheat, corn, and rice in West African markets at prices that made locally produced grain economically unviable. The dumping operation was massive in scale, involving hundreds of thousands of tons of grain stored in warehouses across Europe and North America specifically for this purpose. The grain was of good quality, but was being sold at a loss that would have bankrupted any commercial operation, a loss that could only be sustained through government support. Phase 2 targeted Burkina Faso's currency and banking system. Coordinated selling of the West African CFA franc by international currency traders created artificial scarcity that made it expensive for Burkina Faso to purchase equipment and services needed for processing and distributing the harvest. The currency manipulation was technically legal, but was clearly designed to sabotage the country's economic stability during its most vulnerable period. Phase 3 involved activating dormant legal challenges to Burkina Faso's trade relationships. Obscure environmental regulations were suddenly enforced with unprecedented strictness, blocking exports of traditional crops like cotton and sesame that provided foreign currency earnings. International shipping companies, under pressure from their insurance providers, began avoiding Burkina Faso's ports, making it difficult to export anything and expensive to import essential goods. The economic assault was devastating in its comprehensiveness. Within 2 weeks, Burkina Faso found itself effectively isolated from international markets while facing the challenge of processing and distributing a harvest larger than any in the country's history. But Traoré had been preparing for exactly this scenario. Working with allied governments in the West African Food Sovereignty Alliance, he activated a regional economic support network that had been secretly constructed over the preceding months. Ghana agreed to purchase Burkina Faso's entire cotton crop at above-market prices, providing essential foreign currency. Mali offered to process overflow grain using its own facilities, reducing the pressure on Burkina Faso's limited infrastructure. Chad provided trucks and drivers to transport grain to regions where local processing capacity was overwhelmed. Most importantly, the alliance members collectively agreed to reject the subsidized grain being dumped on regional markets, instead purchasing food exclusively from African producers, even at higher prices. The agreement was formalized through an emergency declaration that framed food sovereignty as a matter of continental security. The declaration stated, African countries will no longer accept the poisoned gift of artificially cheap food that enriches foreign producers while impoverishing African farmers. We choose to pay fair prices for African grain rather than subsidize our own dependency. The final confrontation came during the last week of September, as the main harvest reached its peak. Intelligence reports indicated that foreign operatives had positioned explosive devices at key points throughout the transportation network, prepared to trigger a coordinated attack that would prevent the harvest from reaching storage facilities and distribution centers. The plan was diabolical in its sophistication. Rather than destroying the crops in the field, where the damage would be immediately visible and generate international sympathy, the attack would target the infrastructure needed to process and distribute the food. The grain would rot in the countryside, while the population in urban areas faced shortages, creating the appearance that the agricultural project had failed to deliver on its promises. Traoré's response was to implement what military strategists later called the invisible harvest, a grain collection operation conducted entirely under cover of darkness, using vehicles and routes that had been prepared in secret over the preceding months. Working with traditional chiefs and community leaders, the government organized a massive civilian mobilization that involved virtually every family in rural Burkina Faso. Rather than using obvious grain trucks that could be easily targeted, the harvest was collected using ordinary vehicles, pickup trucks, donkey carts, motorcycles with trailers, and even bicycles equipped with carrying baskets. The grain was moved in small quantities over hundreds of different routes, making it impossible for saboteurs to predict or intercept more than a fraction of the transport. Collection points were established in private homes, schools, and community centers, rather than in obvious commercial facilities that could be easily identified and targeted. The human dimension of the operation was extraordinary. Families that had never owned more than a few sacks of grain at one time found themselves temporarily storing hundreds of kilograms in their courtyards and spare rooms. Children who had been taught that food was scarce and precious were now playing among abundance that their own communities had created. Salif Ouedraogo, the farmer from Zitenga who had first discovered scattered seeds months earlier, became an informal coordinator for harvest activities in his region. It was like the whole countryside had become one big family, he recalled. People who had never spoken to each other were working together to bring in the grain. Old rivalries between villages were forgotten because everyone understood that we were protecting something bigger than ourselves. The security operation supporting the harvest was equally impressive. Rather than deploying obvious military patrols that would attract attention and provide targets for attack, Colonel Issoufou's forces melted into the civilian population, with soldiers disguised as farmers, truck drivers, and market vendors providing covert protection for the harvest activities. The strategy worked because it exploited the knowledge gap that had always handicapped foreign intelligence operations in Africa. While satellite surveillance could track obvious military movements and facility locations, It could not distinguish between normal civilian activity and a coordinated harvest operation conducted through traditional social networks. When the explosive devices were finally triggered on the night of September 28th, they targeted empty roads and abandoned buildings. The real harvest had already been completed and stored through channels that existed largely outside the formal economy and therefore beyond the reach of conventional surveillance and sabotage. The final statistics were stunning even to those who had planned and executed the operation. Despite drought, sabotage, economic warfare, and international opposition, the aerial seed drop had produced over 180,000 tons of food, enough to feed Burkina Faso's entire population for 4 months, and provide significant exports to neighboring countries. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real victory was measured in the transformation of rural communities that had spent decades as passive recipients of international aid into active creators of their own prosperity. Villages that had been slowly emptying as young people migrated to cities in search of opportunities were now buzzing with activity as the harvest created employment and income throughout the countryside. The ecological impact was equally profound. Areas that had been degraded by overgrazing and erosion were showing signs of restoration as the new vegetation stabilized soil and created habitats for wildlife. Water tables were rising in regions where the deep-rooted crops were helping to capture and retain rainfall. Bird populations were returning to areas where they had not been seen for years. Dr. Kone's final report on the project documented achievements that exceeded every projection. We have not only produced food, but we have demonstrated that African agricultural science can solve African agricultural problems. The germination rates, crop yields, and ecological benefits have established new benchmarks for dryland agriculture that will influence farming practices across the continent. The political ramifications extended far beyond agriculture. Traoré's success had demonstrated that African governments could pursue independent policies despite intense international pressure, inspiring similar initiatives across the continent. Countries that had been hesitant to challenge established relationships with former colonial powers began exploring their own sovereignty projects. In Ghana, the government announced plans to achieve complete self-sufficiency in rice production. Within 3 years, using modified aerial seeding techniques adapted for the country's forest and coastal environments. Nigeria committed to ending all wheat imports by 2027 through a combination of domestic production incentives and regional trade agreements with other African producers. The West African Food Sovereignty Alliance, initially viewed with skepticism by many observers, had become a functional regional bloc with growing influence. Member countries had begun coordinating agricultural policies, sharing technology and expertise, and presenting unified positions in international trade negotiations. 1 year after the first helicopter lifted off carrying its cargo of seeds, Burkina Faso had achieved something that most experts had considered impossible: genuine food sovereignty in one of the world's most challenging agricultural environments. But the success had come at a significant cost and had fundamentally altered the country's relationships with the outside world. Trade patterns had shifted dramatically. Traditional export markets in Europe had been largely abandoned in favor of South-South trade relationships with Asia, Latin America, and other African countries. This diversification had reduced vulnerability to economic pressure, but required new logistics networks and financial arrangements that were still being developed. The country's relationship with international aid organizations had been completely restructured. Rather than accepting humanitarian assistance designed to maintain dependency, Burkina Faso now participated only in technical cooperation programs that built local capacity. Foreign NGOs were required to work through local partners and demonstrate that their programs contributed to long-term self-reliance rather than short-term relief. Most significantly, the success of the agricultural project had catalyzed broader sovereignty initiatives across multiple sectors. Burkina Faso was developing domestic capacity for manufacturing agricultural equipment, reducing dependence on imported machinery. Mining operations were being restructured to ensure that more value-added processing occurred within the country, rather than exporting raw materials for processing elsewhere. The transformation was not without its challenges. International isolation had made it difficult to access certain technologies and markets. The constant vigilance required to protect agricultural installations from sabotage had diverted resources from other development priorities. Some traditional allies had distanced themselves from Burkina Faso's government due to pressure from their own international partners. But public support for the new direction was overwhelming. Opinion polls showed that over 80% of Burkina Faso's population supported the Agricultural Independence Initiative, with support even higher in rural areas that had directly benefited from the project. The harvest had generated enough surplus to establish strategic grain reserves while providing exports that earned foreign currency and demonstrated the viability of African agricultural science. The ripple effects of Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution spread across Africa with the force of a political earthquake. What had begun as a single country's response to drought and food insecurity had evolved into a continental movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about African development and dependency. In Mali, where food insecurity had been exacerbated by ongoing conflict, the government announced plans to implement its own aerial seeding program specifically designed for areas too dangerous for conventional farming. The Malian approach would focus on perennial crops that could survive with minimal human intervention while providing food security for displaced populations. Chad's experience with desert agriculture made it an ideal testing ground for extreme condition variants of the aerial seeding technique. Chadian agricultural scientists, working with colleagues from Burkina Faso, began developing seed mixtures specifically designed for areas with less than 200 mm of annual rainfall, conditions previously considered unsuitable for food production. The success stories multiplied across the continent. In Kenya, communities affected by recurring drought began implementing community-based seed scattering programs using small aircraft and even drones. Tanzania's agricultural ministry announced plans to use aerial seeding for rehabilitating degraded lands in the country's semi-arid regions. Perhaps most significantly, the project had inspired a new generation of African agricultural scientists and engineers who saw in Traoré's example proof that African solutions could be both innovative and practical. Universities across the continent began developing specialized programs in dryland agriculture, aerial crop deployment, and sustainable food system design. The international response to this continental movement was increasingly desperate. European agricultural interests, recognizing that their traditional markets were being systematically eliminated, began exploring more aggressive forms of intervention. Trade sanctions were considered but rejected due to the likelihood that they would only strengthen intra-African cooperation. Military intervention was discussed but deemed too risky given the popular support for agricultural sovereignty initiatives across multiple countries. Any attempt to destabilize one government pursuing food independence would likely trigger regional resistance that could spread conflict across West Africa. Instead, a new strategy emerged based on technological dependence. Since African countries were achieving independence in food production, efforts were made to ensure they remained dependent on foreign technology, expertise, and financial systems needed to support their agricultural development. International. Technology companies began offering agricultural equipment and software at subsidized prices, creating new forms of dependency even as food dependency was being eliminated. Financial institutions developed loan programs specifically for African agricultural projects, but with terms that ensured long-term indebtedness to foreign creditors. The strategy was more subtle than previous approaches, but Traoré and his allies had learned to recognize and counter such tactics. The West African Food Sovereignty Alliance began developing its own technology-sharing networks, pooling resources to develop agricultural innovations that could be shared freely among member countries without creating new dependencies. 2 years. After the first seeds fell from Burkina Faso's helicopters, the global agricultural order was fundamentally changed. What had begun as a desperate gamble in one drought-stricken African country had evolved into a movement that was reshaping food systems across the developing world. The success of aerial seeding techniques had been replicated and adapted in dozens of countries facing agricultural challenges. India was using drone-based seed deployment to restore degraded lands in Rajasthan. Brazil was applying the techniques to rehabilitate areas of the Amazon basin affected by deforestation. Even Australia had adopted modified versions of the approach for restoration of fire-damaged ecosystems. The technique had proven particularly valuable in conflict zones where conventional agriculture was impossible, but where food security remained critical. Syria used aerial seeding to restore agricultural areas damaged by war. Afghanistan employed the approach to provide food security in regions too dangerous for traditional farming. Colombia adapted the technique for post-conflict areas where landmines made conventional agriculture hazardous, but perhaps the most significant impact was political rather than agricultural. The success of Burkina Faso's food sovereignty initiative had demonstrated that developing countries could break free from dependency relationships without economic collapse. This realization was inspiring independence movements across multiple sectors and regions. Countries that had been net food importers for decades were achieving self-sufficiency and beginning to export surplus production. Regional trade relationships were replacing North-South dependency structures. South-South cooperation in technology transfer and financial arrangements was reducing the leverage that traditional aid relationships had provided to former colonial powers. The transformation was not limited to Africa. In Latin America, countries began implementing their own food sovereignty initiatives inspired by the Burkina Faso model. Caribbean nations started coordinating agricultural policies to reduce dependence on food imports from North America. Even Pacific Island nations began exploring adaptations of aerial seeding for their unique environmental conditions. International agricultural corporations found themselves facing a fundamentally altered marketplace where their traditional advantages, control, overseas distribution, processing technology, and marketing networks were being systematically undermined by indigenous innovations and regional cooperation agreements. The corporate response was to accelerate consolidation, creating even larger multinational entities capable of competing with regional producer networks. But this strategy only reinforced the political argument for food sovereignty, as communities could see clearly how their local food security was being subordinated to the profit requirements of distant shareholders. 5 years after Ibrahim Traoré first authorized the scattering of 100 tons of seeds across Burkina Faso's savanna, the country had become a case study in successful development policy that was being studied and replicated worldwide. But more than that, it had become a symbol of what was possible when political will, scientific innovation, and popular mobilization combined to challenge seemingly impossible odds. The agricultural transformation had been complete and sustainable. Burkina Faso not only fed itself, but had become a net food exporter, selling surplus grain to neighboring countries and earning foreign currency that funded further development projects. The country's grain reserves were sufficient to weather future droughts without requiring emergency food aid. But the deeper transformation was social and political. The experience of creating abundance through collective effort had fundamentally altered how Burkina Faso's population viewed their relationship with their government, their environment, and the outside world. A people who had been taught to see themselves as victims of circumstances beyond their control had proven they could be architects of their own prosperity. The model was being adapted and implemented across the global South with modifications that reflected local conditions and priorities. In each case, the core principle remained the same. Communities and nations had the right and the capacity to determine their own food systems regardless of external pressure or conventional wisdom about agricultural development. Dr. Aminata Kone, now serving as director of the West African Agricultural Innovation Institute, reflected on the broader implications during a conference in Accra. What we learned in Burkina Faso was not just about seeds and soil, but about power and possibility. When people understand that they can create abundance where others see only scarcity, they begin to question all the other limitations they have been told to accept. The international order had adapted to accommodate the new reality while continuing to seek ways to maintain influence through alternative channels. The old model of agricultural dependency had been broken, but new forms of technological and financial dependency were being constructed to replace it. Yet the precedent had been established and could not be erased. Across Africa and beyond, communities had seen proof that alternative development paths were possible, that South-South cooperation could be more effective than North-South aid relationships, and that the courage to challenge existing systems could yield transformational results. Ibrahim Traore, reflecting on the journey during a quiet moment in his office overlooking the green fields that now surrounded Ouagadougou, understood that the seed drop had been just the beginning of a much larger transformation. We scattered seeds into the wind, but what grew was not just crops. It was the understanding that we are capable of feeding ourselves, governing ourselves, and determining our own future. That understanding, once planted, spreads faster than any seed and is much harder for our enemies to destroy. The revolution that began with helicopters dropping grain onto parched earth had become something much larger, a proof of concept that the global South could innovate, organize, and prosper without permission from those who had historically controlled its fate. And like the seeds themselves once scattered, the idea had taken root in soil that was ready to nourish a completely different kind of harvest. The war for Africa's agricultural independence had been won not through violence or confrontation, but through the simple revolutionary act of proving that abundance was possible, where others insisted only scarcity could exist. In the end, that proof was the most powerful weapon of all, one that could not be confiscated, corrupted, or destroyed, because it lived in the minds and hearts of people who had tasted the fruits of their own liberation and would never again accept hunger as their inevitable fate.